Hello and welcome to the Gaming Grotto. My name is Ezekiel Garcia, and today we have a very special guest with us, Blake J. Harris, author of Console Wars, a book that chronicles the feud between Nintendo and Sega in the early 90s through the eyes of Tom Kalinske, who was the head honcho of Sega of America at the time. The book is now being adapted into both a documentary and a feature film. We were talking about the console wars themselves, our experiences with video games, and the evolution of competition in the industry. We're very thankful at Guff and Stuff for Blake J. Harris taking the time to chat with us. So sit back and enjoy. This is Blake J. Harris. I was thinking about a few things about the console war itself, and I was just thinking back to when, the first console I ever got was a Sega Master System technically, but the thing was that the entire time it was just collecting dust, and it wasn't really until I was playing the NES, and this was back when I was 3, so this was already outdated, and I always thought it was funny because I look back and the house that I lived in was I lived there for the longest time, and there was just that Sega Master System that nobody touched because.
How did it even get there? Who was it purchased for, or who was planning to play it?
I think it was one of my sisters. I think my dad just assumed that my sister wanted to have a video game console, or something along the lines of my dad thought it was going to be the ultimate entertainment system. You know what I mean? Even though it played a specific cartridge, and my dad assumed that NES cartridges were compatible with the Master System. So we just had a dormant Master System, and we never bothered to get any cartridges because A, not only were we not able to find them, and B, it was just we just had NES cartridges, so they just figured it would be a lot more economical to just get an NES, and we did.
Yeah.
Yeah, so, and then and oddly enough, the first video game I've ever played, and I'm not even kidding here, is Ghosts and Goblins.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, and it's so funny because we never got past the second level because I'm pretty sure you know how insanely hard that game is.
Yeah, it's not an easy one.
Yeah, and keep in mind, I'm 4 years old, so here I am just trying to figure out how to defeat the second boss. And it's my sisters couldn't even get past the first half of the level because it would be one checkpoint, and then you have to keep going. And there was always that one part where you're inside a little room, and there were these ogres, and they could actually shoot fireballs from above you. So I always thought that was the most BS thing ever because no other enemy was able to do that.
Yeah.
But yeah, the Master System was just a paperweight, and with when you were doing console wars, the one thing I also wanted to mention was what was the first console you had? Was it just an NES like everyone else, or did you have a?
Yeah, it was an NES. And so I'm 33, and I probably got it when I was around 5, I think in Christmas in '87. And I remember a lot of the stories that I talk about. I might even mention on your show. I always say we because it was me and my brother. We always played together, and I remember when we opened it, I remember being so excited, but also feeling kind of odd about that excitement because I didn't even know what it was. I knew that everyone wanted this thing. I knew that there was something, it was supposed to do something cool, but I kind of didn't even understand really the concept of video games. I guess I was young, so I have that defense. But, and we didn't boot it up until we got home from my grandparents. But, the NES was really the one that was at that sweet spot for me and what made me fall in love with video games.
Right. And would you ever dabble into Sega at all, or were you just a lot of people where it was just strictly Nintendo?
For the most part, you mean before the Genesis?
No, I mean during the Genesis heyday.
Oh, I had the NES during the 8-bit generation, but the 16-bit console I got was the Genesis, not the Super Nintendo. So I was a Genesis kid for the most part during those schoolyard battles.
Right, and it's funny because I never touched a Sega Genesis until I went over to my cousin's house, and that wasn't until I was 10 years old, and this was by the time Nintendo 64 was released. I've already had a Nintendo 64, but I only had 2 games. One of them was Mortal Kombat, and the other one was Oh gosh, I'm trying to remember. I think it was called Mischief Makers. I don't know if you ever played that.
No, I don't know it.
Mischief Maker. It was made by Treasure. The guys behind Gunstar Heroes.
Okay,
And
yeah.
and like the whole concept is like you're like this robot who controls. Basically, the whole idea is that she runs around and you basically grab things, and that's basically like your entire. That's like the entire concept is built around you just grabbing whatever you see and then throwing it at people. It was really fun, but it was a pretty weird game. And I remember for the longest time I got stuck at one part because there was just this part of the game where there's this puzzle you have to solve, and throughout the entire game it gives you no indication as to how to solve this puzzle. So you basically just had to keep guessing, and then one day I just on a happenstance just decided to just do something random, and then it just worked. And then I finally beat the game. So but like with Sega Genesis, the first game I ever played was like Sonic 3.
So how did you miss out on that like whole the whole Genesis thing? I mean, there's yeah, most people were kind of aware of it, and it sounds like you like playing games. So I was just curious.
Right. It's mostly because of the household that I live in. So like I'm pretty like I think the mindset from my parents was the only thing that ever existed was Nintendo. so they just assume, oh, my son, he's playing the NES, so I might as well give him the Super Nintendo, and then Nintendo 64, which I didn't even get for Christmas. Like they just decided to get it at like some sort of pawn shop for like $89.
That's great.
Yeah, and so, and then like I just played like 2 games, and then I finally got Legend of Zelda and a bunch of other games that I would get like during the summer. So honestly, like a lot of my like time with like Nintendo, because I've had NES, Super Nintendo, and Nintendo 64, and then I started, and this was like by the time I was in Nintendo 64, I was already invested in PS1. So I really didn't have any room for like Genesis, to be honest.
Gotcha.
Yeah, and I mean, I've only seen like a few Saturns, but have you ever actually touched a Saturn?
Yes, I've played the Saturn before.
What'd you think of it? Because I didn't think it was too bad.
No, it's fine. It's good. I mean, it's always. I mean, I don't think the reason the Saturn failed was not just because of the hardware. It's a lot of the software stuff, but I mean, it's pretty good. And the Dreamcast, especially, I think was like incredible. I love the Dreamcast. So the fall of Sega is not completely related to hardware, though. After the Genesis, Saturn was a pretty tough pill to swallow.
Right. So, like, what would be like the point where Sega was just falling apart? Like, where would you pinpoint it?
Well, like in the book, I think that leading up to the launch of that 32-bit system and the fact that Sega kind of could have had the N64 or partnered with Sony to do the PlayStation, I think that's kind of the beginning of the end. But the Saturn did not do well, and then the Dreamcast actually started off doing well, and then that was kind of when they pulled the plug on it. So it's tough to say, but I think a lot of it really does come to down to that relationship with Japan, and so I do think like kind of like the beginning of that end was 95, even though they didn't get out of the hardware business for several more years.
Wasn't the Dreamcast like one of the first consoles to actually like have full online support? Like, it did a lot of great things, and it was, like, way ahead of its time.
Yeah, it was really forward thinking.
And, like, I only had, like, a few opportunities to play it. And I honestly enjoyed it, but it's just, to me, it was just one of those things where I just couldn't get a hold of it because, again, the mindset was, I have one console, and that's good enough for me. At least that's what my parents thought, And, I mean, I didn't really mind because I was just still playing the same old Nintendo 64 and PS1. So, it wouldn't make sense for me to get like a new console. I don't think they would want to spend another $300 for a Dreamcast.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah, and like back then, it was like the Super Nintendo, like weren't cartridges back then like $60?
Yeah, they were really expensive. Though I do think it's kind of funny that the consoles were usually $200 or less, which is certainly not cheap. But compared to now, where I feel like it's not uncommon for people to have had a Xbox 360 and a PS3, or people, the consoles are more expensive, and people don't seem to have a problem with owning both of them at times.
Right. And speaking of like 360 and PS3, would you say that there's still kind of a console war going on? Because I think honestly, like a lot of the magic between the competitors is kind of gone. Where like back then it was just like you could just pretty much throw whatever you want to say against another person, and then like it was just fair game.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, obviously, the video game industry there's a lot of money in it, and wherever there's a lot of money, there will be competition. So between the PS4 and Xbox One, Sony and Microsoft do have some sort of quote unquote rivalry or console wars. But yeah, I mean, it's very different than what it was back then, and I think a lot of that has to do with it was the Wild West era because there wasn't really an infrastructure to the industry. The cost of making games, the cost of making the systems was cheaper, so you could do a little bit more with exclusives and stuff like that. And I think the place where you're kind of starting to see some parallels, at least more so to the console wars of yore than what exists in the console world today, is with the virtual reality stuff, even early on between Oculus, HTC, and Sony coming up.
Right, especially with the whole like what was it called, Neo, something like that, PS4.
The Morpheus,
yeah. Sorry, I was like, for some reason I couldn't think of the name. Yeah,
that Trinity PlayStation device. Yeah,
right, exactly. They might as well do that considering the fact, because like honestly, I feel like at this point they'll just do anything to pander to people because it's just become so industrialized now. Because back then it was like you kind of had a sense of like some sort of grassroots thing going on. But like now it's just big companies just working their developers to death for like the holiday so they could release something for the holiday season. And honestly, with games like with the Call of Duty, like how they release their trailers for Call of Duty, and it's like what happens 2 days later, freaking Battlefield releases their trailer. So it's like, instead of now, it's like less about consoles, and now it's like more about like companies trying to compete. And I think honestly that just kind of like, I mean, of course, Nintendo versus Sega, sorry, of course that's like corporate, competitiveness, but it feels like it's a lot more saturated.
It is, and part of the reason that Sega did what they did, as like chronicled in the book, is because they didn't have a lot of money, because they were kind of this underdog. And nowadays, even if Sony is, has a much bigger lead than Microsoft in the console market, it's hard to think of Microsoft as the underdog. That's not their core business, and that's I don't think anyone would really think of Microsoft as the scrappy underdog, just as general as a company.
Yeah, exactly. Because I mean, when you have like not even Bill Gates, because I'm honestly convinced at this point Bill Gates has nothing to do with Xbox anymore. But like with Microsoft, again, you can't really consider them the underdog. Almost at this point, I want to say honestly, a lot of people consider them to be like the evil empire in this so-called console war that we're having right now. So it's like, it's hard to sympathize with someone like Microsoft, especially with the like just very questionable choices they've made in the past few years.
Yeah, for sure.
Like with the whole like Xbox One and all that, and like, because I mean Xbox One, when it launched, it was a freaking disaster. Because I mean you had like the whole hardware issues, and then you had to like keep the Kinect on. You always had to be online and all the kinds of garbage. Yep. And I think honestly with the Kinect, I think that just helped them out. Like removing the Kinect just helped them out so much, because there was so much RAM that was being wasted thanks to the Kinect, and they got rid of that, and a lot of the problems have been solved because of that.
No, it's true, but it's hard to struggle out of the gate, and I think like Wii U had very different problems, but getting out of the gate, they did an awful job. And even though the software, I have a Wii U and I enjoy a lot of the games, but it's hard to really get over that perception when you start off so weakly like that.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like Nintendo, I think honestly, it's almost falling apart, it seems, at this point. Because it's just like the Wii U's doing so like has done so awful, and then it's like they're already thinking about releasing a new console. You know what I mean? It's just like, I don't know. It's like it's so hard to pinpoint exactly when Nintendo is like where Nintendo is at this point.
Yeah, it is. but I mean, I agree with you. It seems like they're on the decline, and it's sad to see, and it's confusing because, who would have expected that they already have this NX console coming out so soon? But I do think like the two good things that Nintendo has in their favor is that they still continue to make great games, which you cannot say about Sega. If you were to kind of try to compare the two, and also Nintendo they still have such valuable intellectual property with Mario and Zelda and stuff, and I'd love to see them do more with that, which they have not yet to date, and they're still pretty protective with it. But they, if for any reason they were to one day just become a third-party software company, they would still have a bigger advantage over everyone else.
Right. Because I still feel that even though, despite what I said, I still feel like Nintendo is a gamers company. Like, they still care about the quality of the games that they put out. They actually care about what people want to play. And I've told my friends this, they don't own Wii's or anything like that. But when I had the Wii, I played Mario Galaxy, and I love that game. And I still do. And I told them that honestly, like, out of all the games that I've played of like the last generation, even the current generation, like that game honestly was like really close to like me just like getting so angry. Because there was like this, of course, there's always that one level where it's like you have to like do everything perfectly, and if you like if you take one misstep, then like you just you're gonna fall through a hole, or you're just gonna get hit by a hammer bro or something like that. And to me, I think Nintendo still has the sense of actually challenging people and rewarding them accordingly. Because now just people are, if people want challenge, of course, everyone's going to tell you Dark Souls, Bloodborne, and all these other games. And I mean, don't get me wrong, I love those games. They're some of my favorite games of all time, but like, it's almost like a niche to, actually have challenge in your games. And I think that's why Nintendo still cares about the quality of the gameplay. And going back to like Nintendo versus Sega, and you were mentioning how like the quality of games that Sega had were kind of lacking. I honestly did think that Genesis actually had some pretty good games, like Gunstar Heroes and like some of the Sonic games.
No, I didn't necessarily mean that. I mean, I think that for one, Sega just had a much higher quantity of games, and some of them were as good and some of them weren't. And during the Genesis era, I think that Sega definitely holds their own or is more successful than Nintendo. I just meant, to look at why Sega failed or why they got out of the hardware business over those next 10 years or so. I don't think the games were as good, and I don't think, whereas Nintendo's quality of games, I think, has still remained at a very high bar.
Right. Oh, yeah. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, if I misinterpreted something, I do apologize for that. Yeah,
it's pretty late here, so I definitely could have.
Right, but still, though, another thing too is that, like, now that I'm thinking about it too, it's like even Super Nintendo, like if you actually look into their library, like I still think that the bar was still pretty high compared to Genesis, but I think Genesis was a little more. It was a more tighter package in terms of the library and the quality of their games. But the funny thing was that if you look into the the Super Nintendo's library, it feels like they released a lot more games, but I feel like the majority of those games, like were just throwaways, like licensed garbage and all this other crap. Because I remember I watched a stream, and like they were going through like the entire library, and they were going through like all these horrid games. Like they even made like what was that one movie with the was it a bulldog, I believe? It was called like Beethoven's Fifth or something like that. They actually made a Super Nintendo game based off of Beethoven's Fifth.
That's hilarious.
Yeah, and then like the Home Improvement game,
Oh yeah, the Home Improvement game.
Where you're fighting dinosaurs with a jackhammer or whatever the hell it was. Yeah. Oh, it was a nail gun. Yeah, you're shooting dinosaurs with a nail gun. Yeah, it was just like a bunch of weird games, and like I think it's like a very 90s thing, to be honest, where it's like if you have a movie, there's probably going to be a game made based off of it.
Yeah, well, it's because you could it was almost worth it financially. If a game only cost $1 million or so to make, you could do it. Whereas now, it's hard. You can't really justify making a game, and it takes much longer if you were to try to come up with something that worked on the PS4 or Xbox One, But obviously, it often did not lead to good quality games, so
No.
maybe that's not a bad problem.
Right. Because like even Genesis, like to me, Sonic, the Sonic games, like to me it always goes like this. It's like it starts off really good, and then it just completely loses it, I think. Because it's like I don't think those games are perfect in any way, and I think like the concept of Sonic where you're just constantly going fast at a high rate of speed, it kind of like just defeats itself in a way, because some of the level design is just like you're just kind of like okay, why am I not going fast anymore? Why do I got to do platforming? Why am I going underwater? And
Yeah.
with like Mario, I mean, you had that, I guess, versatility where you're capable of just doing whatever. You could swim and fly and all this stuff, and there's nothing but collectibles all over the place. Whereas Sonic, it's just a lot more straightforward. And I think that's honestly the reason why I kind of like deviated more towards Mario, and like never really developed, despite playing it at my cousin's house, never really developed a true interest for Genesis. I mean, and again, I think like Super Nintendo, they made good game, they made better games, I felt, but Genesis, they also had some good ones, like like I mentioned, Gunstar Heroes, and that's probably the third time I mentioned that, and I'm pretty sure it's the only reason I mentioned it is because that's probably the game that I enjoyed the most.
Yeah.
Because it's just so insane. But yeah, it's like when I think about the console wars, I think it's like it kind of beckons, a time when competitiveness and just plain, it breeds innovation, I think. And since they were just competing with each other, it's like they were just going out of their way to make sure they released something that was fresh and new, and I think that's missing with like today's industry.
Yeah, no, I do too. I mean, I think that I've obviously spent a lot of time wondering who won the console wars between Sega and Nintendo, and you could argue it different ways. But the real winner, to your point, is us, the consumers, who are getting better quality games, getting more games, getting better peripherals, and all that stuff. And yeah, I mean, you don't see that nowadays, and I think a lot of it is just because of how long it takes to build a game of that the caliber that'll work on these systems, and the cost of doing that. It's not a perfect example, but I think of a game like Toe Jam and Earl for the Genesis, which was an awesome, fun game. But like, I don't know, imagine pitching that game in a room, and imagine pitching something today. Someone saying like, "Oh yeah, let's put $20 million into this weirdo game." Sometimes it's almost like you just have to try making it and seeing, wow, this is actually great. So I kind of miss that, but at least you kind of see those risks taken with mobile games and in virtual reality stuff with game engines. You can do a little bit more nowadays too. So we'll see if there's a resurgence of that.
Exactly. And like, to me, it's like if Toe Jam and Earl were to be pitched, I honestly think it would only be released as like some sort of indie game. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Like something released on like Xbox, like arcade or something like that.
Yeah, no, the indie games, you make a good point. Like that's, I think, where a lot of this exploration is being done, because now there are those tools available through Unity or Unreal Engine that really empower developers to make very high quality games, and you can make games that might sound weird or look weird, but as long as they work well and are fun to play, that's all that really matters. And so it's nice to see that empowerment kind of coming around these last few years.
Right. And I mean, this may come off as as a very vague question, but what is, honest to God, like the weirdest game you've ever played in general? Because there's a lot of odd ones when you're like looking into like indie games. Like if you search online, there's a lot of weird shit.
I don't know. I wouldn't even know how to answer that. I mean, because I feel like I've never really played at length any very weird game. I've just investigated and seen like, wow, that's a pretty odd game. And I don't know what comes to mind first for you. Was there anything you were thinking about when you were asking that question?
There was actually like a few games, and they all stem from like certain different spectrums of video game. One of them that comes to mind is a game called God, what was it called? Oh, it's called Crypt Worlds. It was an indie game released by it was an artist in San Francisco, and she created this first person like adventure game in which you have no idea what's going on, and like everything is very vague. The only thing you get is there's like this evil god trying to destroy the world, but it's like you can't even attack. The only thing you can do is piss on people, and that was it.
It's very bizarre.
Yeah, and that like if I look back earlier, the only other game I could think of is Seaman. Because I remember I played that for like 30 minutes, and I was so creeped out by the concept of it that I had to quit. I was like 11 years old, and I was just like, what the hell am I looking at? Like, I didn't know what to do. I just clicked on him for like 10 minutes, and then like I just got stuck, and I just gave up. Because it was just like such a weird concept of like, you have to keep this fish alive, and it's like, you're just like left to your own devices, and it just felt weird.
Yeah.
But another thing I wanted to mention too, are you like, how are you in terms of like PC gaming? Are you into that at all, or?
Not really, but I'm honestly not much of a game player. I was when I was a kid, and I love, now I don't really play many games. I enjoy watching streaming of games. I love the art that goes into it. Like I always love watching the new game trailers, but I guess I'm not too up on what's being played in PC, and especially whenever I'm working on a book, I kind of, I'm away from playing for a while.
And with the console wars, like the one thing I've always fascinated with was during this time as Nintendo and Sega were competing, I was just thinking about like in the PC spectrum, like there was like a lot of innovation going on. Like Wolfenstein 3D was first released, Doom, like
For
a bunch.
sure.
Yeah, like ID was releasing a lot of great games, and especially with like Ultima 7, I believe, was released in 1982, and like if you play that, it's absolutely amazing, like what kind of game was capable of being made on a PC, and like even back then, of course it looks antiquated, it looks old, it's very primitive, but back then, that was just something that nobody's ever seen before. And was Nintendo or Sega, were they ever threatened by PC gaming? Was that something that they ever had any concern about?
Not really. I mean, it's kind of interesting, like, what you're talking about, like, even as far back in the 80s, like, a good kind of litmus test for me on the popularity of PC games and the way that they were perceived to true hardcore, quote unquote, at the time gamers, was Electronic Arts, because they were founded, I believe, in 82, maybe 83, and they were founded as a basically high quality artist empowered game company for PCs. And they made, the packages for the games were beautiful. The games themselves, albeit antiquated, to your point, but like they were fantastic for the time. They were probably better. They were definitely better than anything you could play on the Atari and Television, Coleco, and arguably better than what would come on the NES. But EA was not making money. There just wasn't that big of an audience, that big of a demand for computer gaming at the time. So, kind of out of that apathy, Nintendo rose, and Electronic Arts, why I always found it interesting is like they started to make their money and started to become the evil empire that they are through console gaming. But by midway through the 90s, they kind of returned to PC gaming, and I don't know that Nintendo or Sega ever really perceived PC gaming as a threat. Definitely, I would say not Nintendo, though they tend not to think of these things as threats that are. And Sega, they released Doom, and they were kind of like much more trying to tap to that same overlapping market of like older gamers and first-person shooters and stuff like that. So, I think Sega probably was at least conscious of it, but weren't around by the time that PC gaming really, really took off, and Nintendo just kind of, as they always do, for better or worse, kind of stuck their head in the sand and just kept doing their thing.
Right. Yeah, because like even with Doom, because a lot of people like to say Doom was like the game that like got everybody into like getting interested in like computer games, like playing games on the computer. and like the first game, obviously the first console I ever had was, the NES. And I played that for a bit, but like the first computer game I ever played was Quake, the first Quake. I got that at a yard sale, like when I was like 8. And I remember I thought that was like the coolest thing ever. And it's like I kind of like look back because that game was released in '96, and this was like early Nintendo 64, Saturn, PS, like the closest thing that could compete with PC, was like maybe a PS1 in terms of hardware. And I remember that Nintendo 64, they released their own version of Quake, which I never purchased. I only Quake 2, which I thought was absolutely amazing, because I didn't think that they would make something that good on Nintendo 64, because I did play Quake 2 on PC, and PS1 actually too. And basically they're like 3 completely different games. And like the reason I always found it fascinating, like early 90s, mid 90s, especially during when Nintendo and Sega were going up against each other. It was just that, computer games were starting to take, like a lot of people were starting to get a lot more interested in it. And, games like Duke Nukem and, a bunch of other games I can't really think of right now because there were so many of them. They were really starting to, a lot of interest was had playing PC games, and especially despite the fact that consoles were still huge, because I'm pretty sure like PC games they would never be able to make as much, like I'm pretty sure sales were nowhere near as high as getting like GoldenEye or something like that.
Yeah, no, that's right. But I mean, I think that a part of the PlayStation success was kind of how much in common it had with PCs, and you can also with the copying of CDs and the fact that it was CD based, and there was a similarity with PC gaming in that regard. And I remember at the time that was kind of one of the appeals to me, was just how PlayStation felt very much like PC gaming, or not very much, but it felt more similar than cartridge based Nintendo or the crappy Saturn.
Right. And the funny thing was that something that always blew my mind was the fact that Sony, like the PlayStation, was originally meant to be a peripheral for the Super Nintendo. Yeah. Like I never knew that until like, I don't know, months ago,
Yeah. No, I mean, I spent a lot of time when I was working on this book just kind of imagining these parallel universes where different things had played out, and wondering what that would look like.
Yeah, exactly. Like even like Final Fantasy VII. That was originally supposed to be a Nintendo 64 game, but the thing was that the memory and the RAM of cartridges were so limited that they had no choice but to go to PlayStation, and they decided to make a 4-disc game. So it kind of goes to show how big of a game they were trying to make, and obviously I don't even think Nintendo 64 cartridges were capable of holding what a compact disc could hold.
No, and that's why it's really curious that Nintendo chose to go with cartridges. And that's, I would say, probably just because of how they like to operate, where it's proprietary technology that they own and that everything goes through them and can't be bootlegged, or it can't be bootlegged as easily. And maybe it was a mistake. I mean, I love the N64, so it's hard to call it a mistake. But in terms, maybe for sales, it would have been better for them if they'd went with the CD route.
Right, probably, but still, I think there was a lot of potential that could have had with discs, because I know that during like the last few years of Nintendo 64's run, in a prominent run, they were designing a add-on that played discs, and it basically went nowhere. Like the only thing was, it was like a few demos in Japan and stuff like that, but that was it. And it was called like Nintendo 64. I think it was called DD. I think it was the name of the device. And it just never went anywhere. And I remember like there was a few magazines that were talking about it too, but then like it just slowly faded away and nobody ever heard about it again. Yeah. I mean, there was a lot of interesting stuff that was going on, especially with like discs and CDs, and everybody was trying to do something different. And then you had Saturn. And honestly, like the Sega Saturn went nowhere, because I mean, it's kind of hard to, excuse me, it's kind of hard to even name like you know, 5 games. You know what I mean? It's just, I mean, the only ones I can think of is Clockwork Knight, Nights into Dream, Sonic R, and that's it. That's all I can think.
Virtua Fighter, Virtua Cop. Those were like their launch.
Right, but I don't even think they would count because those are arcade ports.
That's like so much of what it was. I feel like because Sega is historically an arcade company, and so them doing that again.
And I think, and speaking of which, like arcades too, I think, and that was another aspect of games, outside of Nintendo, Sega, and I know that Sega, I always think, and I still think to this very day, Sega is the king of arcades. Like I think they made some of the most innovative and some of the most impressive arcade games you can find. And like, did Nintendo even care at this point, like in the 90s, about making arcade cabinets? Because I do understand they had this thing called, I think it was called Supervision or something like that. But all that was like for any Super Nintendo games, and you could like pick and choose each one, and you played it at a certain amount of time depending on like how many coins you put in. But like, did Nintendo have like any concern over arcades at all?
I mean, I don't think so, really. Definitely not in the United States, and even in Japan. I mean, to this day in Japan, Sega still has a really strong presence with arcades. It's not like in the U.S. where arcades are few and far between. If you walk down busy city streets, there's still like 4-story high Sega arcades. So the arcade business is still bigger over there, and Sega still has a large footprint. And it's maybe that's part of the reason that the Saturn was held back. Maybe they focused too much on arcade games, or kind of porting things over, or thinking that there was a similarity. And Nintendo definitely was not a priority for them. Come the 90s, especially the mid to late 90s.
Right, and and I think probably the best part about the whole console war was just the type of commercials that they would create. Just to get anyone's attention. Like, I'm pretty sure you remember the Yoshi's Island commercial where it was just like this big fat guy, and he eats, and he just keeps constantly eating, and he blows up like it's Monty Python, and I'm just like, I look back at that and I was like, how does this sell games? You know what I mean? Like, how does that even sell? Because that's like, at that point, it's just like gross out, and then like you had like another commercial where it was just like a montage that shows like a bunch of kids running around the streets or whatever, and then like of all the songs they chose, it was like a song by like Butthole Surfers or something that.
Well, that was a very confused time for Nintendo, because that was like Sega had started to surpass, and they say like Nintendo was not hitting that teen audience, and Butthole Surfers was something that you would never think would go with Nintendo, nor would the gross out that you're kind of humor that you're talking about from the Yoshi's Island. But that was like probably around Nintendo's like Play It Loud campaign, which felt like off brand, but was them attempting to evolve.
And like I mean, Sega had the Genesis does when Nintendo don't. But that was like early during the Genesis. Like I think it was like before Sonic.
It was
and then like eventually it turned to like blast processing, which to this very day I have no idea what blast processing is supposed to be, if it happens to be a real thing.
Well, that's talked about in the book, and it's not really a real thing.
Oh Jesus! Yeah, I figured so.
No. But yeah, I mean that's definitely just some Sega marketing pyrotechnics, but kind of in between those phases that you were talking about, the Genesis does with Nintendo and the blast processing, there was the Welcome to the Next Level campaign, which is what I think a lot of people remember too, and blast processing was a part of it, but it was those commercials that ended with the Sega, the scream,
right?
Sega.
So good.
Yours is way better than mine, and and that was like really that was during like the heyday of the Genesis, and I think that's just like kind of beautiful commercial advertising work that's style and substance. It looks really nice.
All right. So with this book itself, like how was what was like the process? Like, how did that go? How did you go about writing this book? Like, how did you start? Like, when was the moment where you said, all right, I'm going to make this book, And like, how did you get this project going? Like, what was like the first step into getting this book made?
Probably the first step I would say before, the first step towards writing Console Wars was really just wanting to read Console Wars. Was really, before I even set out to write it, was just having the curiosity to want to read a book like this that told the behind the scenes business story of what happened, and being surprised that no such book existed and that there were so few books about the video game industry in general. And so, it was not necessarily at that point that I said, aha, I'm going to do this, but it had my interest piqued. And, then the point where I probably thought, I really want to dedicate several months and what became years to doing this, and that I thought it was important, was after speaking with Tom Kalinske, who was the CEO of Sega of America from 1990-96, because that kind of showed me that for sure there's a great story here, for sure there's great characters here, and for sure that, this could really be a book that gamers and non-gamers could really appreciate in a good way into understanding the video game industry.
I understand. Like, this is like obviously like a really big book. This is like over 500 pages. Yeah. And from what I understand, there was over 200 people you've interviewed for this book. And was there any interesting story or anything that stood out that you ended up leaving off of this book, if any?
Oh, for sure. I mean, I've said before that the book definitely could have been 1,000 pages long or even longer. But, I always tried to really make sure that it was a fast-paced book and that it really stayed true to its central narrative, even if there were some interesting things. And a lot of it was the game development stuff, where, pretty much behind every game, whether it's successful or unsuccessful, is usually a good story, because it's a bunch of creative people trying to do something that either works or doesn't work. And so, for me, I guess my personal interests that I maybe should have mentioned earlier with the Genesis and with any of gaming, I always like the sports games. So for me, EA and EA Sports, and just kind of like any of the sports games that were out during that era, and I played a lot on the PlayStation 2. So kind of learning about that, but in particular, my favorite all-time game is NHL '94. And I ended up writing up like a 8,000 word story about how that was made, for the read-only memory website. But, stuff like that was stuff that I did not include in the book. That was, I wouldn't say it was hard, because I really tried to keep in mind the reader's time, and this was already a long book. But there was a lot of fun stuff that I couldn't include because it just didn't really make sense, but were really impressive and interesting stories on their own right.
And like when you were talking about like the story behind developing these games, and I'm pretty sure like if you were to make a book or write a book about like how it is today, I'm pretty sure like every company would be jumping down your throat, because like I don't know if you read about these horror stories that go on nowadays, where it's like EA, they're like basically working everybody to death, because like it's like basically, instead of just trying to create something, now it's like they have deadlines. We got to make this game. We got to release this game, for the holiday season. Call of Duty, Activision is make this game. And now we have competitors and all this stuff. So it's like becoming less competitive and a lot more like trying to keep up, and trying to play catch up. And I think honestly, like with Console Wars, from like the perspective of back when, the industry was a lot more young, and a lot more, for lack of a better term, grassroots. I know I already used that term before, but, it's definitely a lot more interesting, especially during that time, when you had your Super Mario Worlds and your Sonics and, all those games, that were just plain fun instead of just, just a brand.
Yeah, I guess.
If that makes any sense. Yeah.
No, I think you make a lot of sense. I just don't know that I agree with that. Just in terms of, I don't think that they took it any easier in making the games back then, and more so, you're right. You do read. Sorry if you can hear an ambulance in the background.
No, you're fine.
But I mean, you do read horror stories about what it's like to be a developer nowadays. But I don't know that I think that's. I guess I can only relate from my own experiences, and writing there's similarities in the whole creative process, and I know it's grueling, and you have to work crazy hours, and you also. So I don't know, I don't work for a company, so I don't what's right in terms of should they be paying you more? Should the company be asking you to do this? I just know that I work around the clock, and we're speaking at 1 a.m, and that's just what you do. Like what, every day of the week is a work day, and that's because I love what I do. So, I don't know what it used to be like versus what it's like now. It's a different mindset. It's a different kind of business than a lot of other businesses.
Right. And I think, honestly, to be perfectly honest, I think it's like my mindset was coming from the idea that, like you said, it's a completely different mindset. Because I wouldn't doubt that, Nintendo and Sega were working their employees to death either, especially since they were so competitive.
Yeah.
But I think it was just like my mindset was just the idea that the mentality has changed to where now it's like, it's like not based on what they want to do, but based on what they have to do, and that's why you have like Call of Duty and all that stuff going on.
I think that maybe what you're talking about to some extent is the size of the teams. Back, like literally Sonic team was like 2 guys, or eventually like 7 or 10 guys. And so, there's something kind of romantic about the idea, or at least satisfying if you're a creator, that you're probably actually being heavily involved in the creation of the game and that your decisions really matter. Whereas if you're working on a AAA title, you're one of several hundred. And so maybe your job this week is to focus on making the wheels of the tank. And, that's an important job because someone needs to do it, but it's not as creatively fulfilling, or at least to us on the outside, it would seem, as figuring out, all right, what do we want this level design to look like for the second level of Sonic,
Yeah, that's pretty much where that's exactly where I'm coming from, actually. So, yeah, it's like, I guess I just didn't word it as well as I wanted it to, but
you're fine.
Yeah, no problem. But probably the most exciting thing about this book, honestly, is the fact that you're making 2 movies out of this, or at least Seth Rogen and Evan Goldberg are making 2 movies. And I just think that's just, to me, like, as somebody who's played video games for most of my life, I just think it's absolutely like absolutely special that this story is about to become a movie in 2 different ways.
Yeah, no, that's good. I mean, that's kind of what the goal was, even just in terms of the style of the writing of the book. I mentioned earlier I wanted it to be interesting to gamers and non-gamers, because I wanted everybody to sort of appreciate how unique and special the video game industry is. And so, if I can get my grandma to read this because it's a story about a guy on a beach, and that's how it starts off, and it doesn't sound like it's, here's a lot of technical information that you need to know, but you sort of realize, oh, this is what goes into making a game. This is what goes into selling a game. And, and same thing with the movie. I love the idea of people who are maybe don't consider themselves gamers, or who haven't picked up a controller in a while, or even celebrating a culture of people who have made this such a big and important industry, and to be able to tell that story through a documentary and also through a feature film is really special.
Right, and like in terms of the feature film, the adaptation, has that actually been in the process? Is it already in production, or is it something that you guys are about to start working on?
No, it's not in production yet, but we've actually been working with Seth and Evan for at least 3 years now. The relationship has been in place for a while, and so as we reach the final stages of the documentary, although it's a separate project than the feature film, it's one that goes hand in hand. It's kind of figuring out, all right, how do you take a 550-page book, and what would that look like as a 90-page documentary, and kind of that helps answer questions of what would this look like as a 90-minute or 2-hour-long feature film. And so it definitely is not, production has not started. They're not filming or anything right now, but I think that we're much further along in conversations than you would typically be in an adaptation. They were involved before we even sold the book proposal. They were, huge supporters of the story and huge gamers themselves that had great memories of Sega and Nintendo. So, it's definitely in capable hands and capable minds that have been thinking about it for some time.
And when, how, and I'm pretty sure you've been asked this multiple times, but Like, what was going through your head when like Seth and Evan decided to write the forward for your book? Like how did that go?
That happened after we had already planned on the movie thing, but it was still amazing. But I'll tell you what was going through my head the first time that I met Seth and Evan, which was I remember I was sitting in their office and they came in, and Seth like stuck out his hand to shake my hand, and I didn't get up and I didn't react for like what felt like several minutes, but it was really just a matter of seconds. And it was because I was like having this stupid thought process of like, oh, it's the guy from the movie. Oh, like I'm in a movie. Oh, I wonder what my character's going to do now. And then sort of me realizing, wait a minute, no, like I have to actually react. This is like real life. So I was pretty blown away and had that surreal moment. And so, as I said, or implied, hopefully, that I really admire and love those guys. So having them do the forward, having them support the book in any way, and also be interested in the story has just been incredible and life changing. I had a day job trading commodities as I was hoping to become a writer, and finally I've been able to become a full-time writer. So that was really sincerely life changing.
Right, and like with the writing, is this something that you, in terms of like the subject of video games, is this something that you wish to continue pursuing, like some sort of other aspects of video game industry, or is there something that you want to do beyond console wars or beyond video games in general?
Something that I'm definitely still fascinated in. I still think that my number one priority when looking for a story is going to be a story and not to me, this is more than just a video game story. That's obviously what's at the heart of it, but it's a story it's an underdog story, and it's just a great story. It's a great success story. So my thought after finishing this was not, all right, let me now do this for PlayStation versus N64 and kind of like the next generation, because I have not yet found a story that I felt like was as compelling to me as this one, and it very well could be out there, and I just haven't found it. And I'm kind of, that's a long way of saying that the new book that I'm working on is about virtual reality, and so once again, it's heavily touches upon the video game industry because I think VR gaming is outstanding, but it's not necessarily a book about gaming, or at least that's not how I would describe it necessarily. It's a story about launching this VR revolution that's going to have implications in the medical world and education and all these different things. But it's very much at the center of it all is gaming and entertainment, and I think that a lot of the greatest games over the next half of the decade will be in virtual reality. Yeah,
I can honestly see that happening, because I think it's gone to the point now where VR is taken, like the development of VR is taken with a lot more care. And it's something that's taken a lot more seriously than it used to be. Because back then it was just like it was like not even a novelty, you know what I mean? It was just something that was very, very niche. And I think honestly it could become a thing, especially with Sony trying to do their version of VR.
Yeah,
and I think
exactly.
that could definitely take it to, where VR, where the people who are working on the Oculus or whatever, it'll take it to where they want it to, take it.
And think about to what you were talking about earlier, during this conversation, we've talked about Doom and Wolfenstein and Quake, sort of launching PC gaming, and one of the co-founders of id Software that made all those games, John Carmack, is now with Oculus, and that's not. He's there because he's a legendary game developer and technology. Yeah,
and then honestly, I think he's a genius. You know what I mean? It's like it's like I think he takes a concept and he gives it a lot more. Like, he puts a lot of intelligence into his designs, I think. And with him running Oculus, I think that's just a match made in heaven. I hate to use cliches, but that's the best way I could describe it, to be honest. Like how I feel in terms of him working with Oculus.
Yeah, no, he was definitely a really important person that they brought in early on, and has a huge impact in the direction of the company, especially the mobile VR has really been what he's been focused on, and That's what I have been playing with most days, the Samsung Gear VR thing that you can attach to your phone. And he did an incredible job, and he'll continue to do stuff. So I think that a big part of the future of gaming is going to be VR. And so in this book, a lot of it will be, gaming will once again be a big part of it.
Yeah, almost definitely. And I guess one last thing before we let you go finally is at this point, with Console Wars released and 2 movies coming up, what's next for you? Like, what do you plan on doing next, if anything?
So obviously working on the virtual reality book takes up a good amount of my time and has me super psyched. Then the other thing that I spend a good amount of time doing is writing pieces for the How Did This Get Made podcast that's hosted by Paul Scheer and Jason Mantzoukas and June Diane Raphael, which is, they talk about bad movies and they're comedians, so they make fun of them. But I answer the question of how they actually got made. And so there's a new episode every 2 weeks. So that gives me only 2 weeks to figure out how bad movies like Solar Babies or Masters of the Universe got made. And it's a similar type of thing as, although it seems very distant from Console Wars or from virtual reality, it really fits into what interests me, which is kind of looking for the behind-the-scenes story, the character-driven stories of how these things happen and whether they turn out good or bad, just kind of picking up the pieces and trying to figure out what happened.
All right. So other than that, is there anything else you want to mention or anything else you want to plug or anything like that?
No, if your listeners have a question for me, they can definitely reach out at any time on Twitter at Blake J. Harris NYC. I love answering questions or hearing compliments or criticisms, whatever you've got to say. I usually try to respond to people, and that's all I got to plug. Any final questions or anything else?
Honestly, I guess the last thing I should say is, this is me being absolutely sincere. I really, really am thankful for the fact that you actually taken the time to do this interview with us. Because it's something that we're starting from the ground up, and we've been doing this for a few months now. And to us, this was this again, a few months, but still this interview to us was the big one, you know what I mean? Because you are at a pedestal where, you have done something huge, especially with video games. It's not like, you're not just a developer, you're not just some guy on YouTube. You've created something, and it's something that a lot of people have very, very deep interest in. And it's funny because there's a few other video game related books and stuff like that, but and for some reason, the one book was written by a guy named Bob Chipman. I don't know if you've heard about this. I forgot what the book was called, but it was supposed to be a chronicle of Super Mario Brothers 3 and why it was the greatest game ever made. And to me, that was such an odd book to read. It was very strange because it was it almost felt like he was trying to live vicariously through that game. And it just felt odd. But with this book, I think it's seriously the way you put it. I remember you first mentioned this when I first heard about it on Kotaku, and this was a couple years back, that you wanted to create something because there was always these books about musicians and bands and all this stuff, and you wanted to create something that was behind the scenes of something like video games, and because no one's ever done it before. And I think, honestly, it's a very interesting path to take. And I think, honestly, you've done a very good job in portraying, what happened during this era that, people fondly remember. Not only people my age, well, technically I'm a little too young for this era, but, people your age and, just anybody who's experienced Super Nintendo or Genesis. And I think, honestly, this is something that kind of, I want to go as far as say needed, but this was something that I think is definitely different, and I think it's very commendable that you've undertaken this project.
Oh, I appreciate that, and who knows whether it was needed or not, but for me, it was really driven by my own curiosity, and
Mm-hmm.
and as someone who as you mentioned, like I grew up during this time, it was such a big part of my life, and I realized, wow, I don't even know like anything about the people who created this experience for me.
Mm-hmm.
So, if nothing else, I was glad that this book could finally shine a spotlight on these wonderful, talented, curious, clever people who launched grassroots campaigns and were able to improve my life and improve my childhood. So, I love talking about the book, and I obviously loved writing it. So, I appreciate coming on the show and talking about that process with you.
Oh, thank you so much for again taking the time for this, and hopefully, when the movie comes out, hopefully we'll be able to reach out for you again. Because I definitely would look forward to talking to you. During that process. All right.
Sure.
So at this point, we'll let you go right now, and I just wish nothing but the best of luck to you in this new project that you guys are working on. All right.
Thank you so much, and to you too.
Not
Good
a
luck with the
problem.
podcast.
Thank you so
Take
much.
care.
That actually means a lot to us. All right. You take care as well. All right.
Take care. Bye.
And bye-bye. We cannot thank Blake J. Harris enough for taking the time to do this interview. Be sure to check out his Twitter at Blake J. Harris NYC, and also his website at blakejharris.com. Until then, this is the Gaming Grotto. I am Ezekiel Garcia, and we'll see you guys next Tuesday. Take care.